A few months ago, I was sitting in a cafe in Montevideo, looking out at the Plaza Independencia. If you squinted, you'd swear you were in Madrid or Lisbon. The architecture is grand, the city is safe, and the people are highly educated. By almost every standard metric we use to judge a nation's potential democracy, human capital, rule of law, Uruguay has done everything right. It is the star pupil of its region. Yet, when you look at the long-term economic charts, there is a stubborn, frustrating gap. It hasn't converged with the world's richest nations the way countries like Spain or Ireland did. The standard explanation is that Uruguay just needs better domestic policies or more innovation. But then I saw a simulation that changed how I think about the wealth of nations. Imagine for a second that we could drag and drop a country across the globe. What if we took Spain, a country that was a struggling autocracy just a few decades ago, and instead of letting it join the European Union, we dropped it into the institutional ecosystem of Latin America? According to a sophisticated new generative AI model, the result isn't just a minor dip in growth. Spain's entire structural identity shifts. It becomes more volatile, less complex, and significantly poorer. In the simulation, Spain doesn't just grow slower, it loses the very internal strength we thought it owned. This raises a haunting question. Is development actually something a country achieves through its own grit and policy? Or is it a relational outcome, a byproduct of the club you're invited to join? We've always been told that a country's fate is in its own hands, but the data suggests that belonging to a dense, high-trust institutional neighborhood might be the only thing that actually guarantees long-term success. If development is an invitation rather than a solo race, it changes everything we thought we knew about why some nations thrive, while others, despite doing everything right, remain stuck in place.
And that thought experiment, that image of dragging and dropping Spain, is really the perfect frame for this entire deep dive.
It really is.
Because we're fundamentally questioning the entire premise of national success. But before we can even, get to the idea of a club or an institutional neighborhood, we have to lay the groundwork.
Okay.
We have to really establish the internal foundational role of institutions. We first have to understand why they matter so much in the long run. Why we see these radical differences between countries that, on the surface, look very similar.
Okay, let's unpack that. Because when economists talk about institutions, especially as the fundamental cause of growth, it's a very specific definition, right? It's not like we're talking about buildings or government agents.
That's a common misconception. We're talking about the rules of the game. The basic, often unwritten rules that structure all of society.
The rules of the game. I like that.
They are the societal choices that determine who has de jure political power. That's power by law. And they govern all the economic outcomes. And for long-term prosperity, the consensus is really clear. You need good economic institutions.
And what defines good? What's the checklist for a good institution?
It really boils down to two non-negotiable foundations for creating wealth. First, you need secure property rights.
Okay.
Investors, innovators, even just, everyday people, they all need to know that if they build something, if they create value, the state or some powerful person can't just arbitrarily seize it.
That makes sense.
And second, and this is just as crucial, they have to provide relatively equal access to economic resources to a broad cross-section of society.
Not just for the elites.
Exactly. If property rights are only secure for a tiny, narrow elite, that's not a system for growth. That system is designed for rent extraction, for pulling wealth out of the system, and it fails the good institution test. The security has to be widely available for an economy to really maximize its potential.
And the power of that definition, it becomes just chillingly clear when you look at the case of North and South Korea. This is always brought up as the perfect natural experiment in economics.
It is.
You have a fixed geography, a fixed culture, and then suddenly the rules just completely change.
It's probably the single most powerful demonstration of the institutional hypothesis we have. Think about it. For centuries, Korea was unified. Culturally, linguistically, geographically, it was one place. Then, around 1950, it's just cleaved in two at the 38th parallel.
And they go on completely different paths.
Completely different. The North adopts a Soviet-style socialist model under Kim Il-sung. It's all about centralized control, the complete abolition of private property, state dictatorship over every single economic decision. The South, on the other hand, well, after some periods of instability, it gradually embraces private incentives, markets, and a really aggressive export-led growth model, especially after Park Chung-hee's reforms in the 1960s.
The difference in the outcomes, it almost defies belief. They started at basically the same place.
I've even read that the North might have had a slight industrial advantage at the very beginning.
They did. There was more heavy industry in the North. But by the year 2000, the data reveals just a colossal institutional failure. South Korea's per capita income had soared. It was up to $16,100.
And the North.
Meanwhile, North Korea's income was just languishing at $1,000. $1,000! That's a level comparable to the absolute poorest nations in sub-Saharan Africa.
Wow.
That's a 16-fold gap, created entirely by different institutional paths in just half a century. It's just overwhelming evidence that the rules of the game, and not something innate like culture or geography, are what primarily determine long-run prosperity.
Okay, so if the path to wealth is so obvious, secure property rights, let lots of people participate, we have to confront the big question. Why do so many societies throughout history and even today knowingly choose bad institutions? This is the absolute crux of it. This is the institutional commitment problem. The choice of institutions, it isn't really an economic efficiency problem. It's a political power problem. It's rooted in social conflict.
Okay.
Elites, or any group holding political power, they operate under this fundamental constraint. They cannot credibly commit not to use that power for their own narrow self-interest tomorrow.
Let me push on that a little bit. On the idea of rationality, if you're a powerful elite, wouldn't it be in your long-term rational interest to choose the institutions that make the whole pie bigger? The aggregate wealth. I mean, even if you only get a slice, that slice would eventually be bigger than the slice you'd get from a tiny, inefficient pie.
That's the common sense assumption, and it makes perfect sense, but it fails because it ignores the political dimension. The elite can't separate efficiency from distribution. So let's say a dictator promises a bunch of foreign investors that their property will be secure, their profits won't be nationalized, all to encourage massive investment. The second that investment starts generating wealth, that dictator still holds all the drawer political power. He can change the rules overnight, nationalize the assets, and keep all the profits for himself. And because there's no higher authority, no impartial court that can enforce his original promise, that promise is simply not credible.
So the powerful groups, they recognize that if they create truly inclusive institutions, they might make the whole country richer. But at the same time, they risk losing control over how that wealth is distributed, and they might even lose their political power in the process.
Exactly. Therefore, it becomes a completely rational choice for them to prefer extractive or bad institutions. These institutions, they might limit aggregate growth, they might make the entire nation poorer in the long run, but they maximize the elites' personal immediate profits, and crucially, they ensure their political survival and their control. The stability of their own private dominance trumps the national economic interest every time.
And that realization, it really shifts the whole discussion away from just pure economics and into political history.
It has to.
Yeah.
And that political history gives us this profound historical analogy. We can contrast the rise of, say, the mercantile class in England and the Netherlands with what happened in Spain and Portugal, where absolutism became more entrenched.
Yeah.
They all faced the same global opportunity, right? The rise of Atlantic trade in the 16th and 17th centuries.
Let's talk about those diverging paths. England and Spain are a great example. In England, you have this expansion of Atlantic trade that just dramatically increases the wealth of new groups in society.
Right. The merchants, the gentry, the commercial landowners.
Their rising wealth gives them de facto political power. So power based on their resources and their ability to organize, not on the law. And their interests often clashed with the established power, the crown, whose main interest was, predation, taking assets through taxes to fund wars.
And the English Civil War, the Glorious Revolution, these were basically the moments where these newly rich groups used their de facto economic power to fundamentally rewrite the rules of the game.
Right.
They changed the political institutions to secure de jure power for themselves.
That is the critical step, isn't it? The institutional step. After the Glorious Revolution of 1688, you see these constraints on the executive, on the king, being codified into law.
Yes, the 1689 Bill of Rights. It ensured that Parliament controlled state finances. It created judicial independence. It restricted the Crown's ability to just raise arbitrary taxes or have a standing army without Parliament's okay. And this wasn't just some political shuffling. This was the establishment of credible commitment. It secured property rights for the wider business community, and that kicked off a virtuous cycle of investment, innovation, and ultimately long-run economic growth.
And meanwhile, the Iberian powers, Spain and Portugal, they go in the complete opposite direction.
Exactly. In Spain and Portugal, the rise of trade didn't lead to more constraints on the monarchy. It led to a consolidation of royal power. In Castile, for example, the crown had already moved in the early 1500s to basically gut the power of representative bodies, the Cortes.
So they were ineffective.
Totally ineffective against royal demands for taxes.
Sure.
This move toward greater absolutism meant the crown could just keep predating on the population. The elites found that the best way to get rich was to get in good with the crown's extractive power, not through independent business protected by the rule of law.
And the consequence is just so stark. By the 19th century, England and the Netherlands, because they secured those broad-based property rights, they became the industrial and financial leaders of the world.
While Spain and Portugal, having chosen maximal absolutism and rent extraction, became impoverished, economically backward nations, the institutional choices they made cast this incredibly long shadow for centuries.
Exactly. The lesson seems to be that development isn't just about having resources, it's about having institutions that prevent the powerful from just taking them.
That's a perfect summary.
So that sets the stage perfectly for this more dynamic part of the story. If political power determines the rules, and those rules can last for centuries, what happens when an external overwhelming force comes in and imposes a new, radically different set of rules? And this, of course, brings us to the colossal institutional experiment of colonialism.
Colonialism really does serve as this powerful historical example of an institutional reversal. It shows that imposed institutional structures can completely override geography and even a country's initial level of wealth.
Right.
European powers imposed wildly different institutions all over the globe, and their choice was almost never random. It was based on the initial conditions they found, specifically the density of the existing native population.
Okay, so talk us through that. How did the initial conditions determine the kind of institution that got imposed?
Well, in areas that were already rich, that were densely settled, and that had existing centralized governments, think of the Aztec and Inca regions in Mexico and Peru.
Right, established civilizations.
Yes. The European colonizers, mostly the Spanish, found it much easier and more profitable to set up extractive institutions. These were systems like the encomienda and the Mita labor systems, which were explicitly designed to just maximize the transfer of wealth and resources back to Europe. They offered basically zero protection for the property rights or political participation of the broad native population.
So the wealthiest, most advanced civilizations in the world in 1500 were basically cursed by their own wealth. It made it easier for the Europeans to come in and just set up a quick profit extractive system.
That's a great way to put it. They were cursed by their own success. Conversely, in sparsely settled areas, particularly in parts of North America like the New England colonies or Australia, there just wasn't a massive native population to exploit.
So they couldn't set up that same system.
They couldn't. So in these areas, large numbers of European settlers arrived, and they often intended to make the place their permanent home, to work the land themselves. And these settlers immediately demanded institutions that protected their own property rights and promoted representative government to stop the colonial elite or the crown from becoming predatory toward them.
And this is what created the great institutional reversal. Over centuries, the places that were initially poorer and less populated in 1500, like the United States or Canada, they end up with a better, more inclusive institutions.
And those institutions, in turn, provided the platform for sustained, broad-based prosperity, which led to a long-run reversal of global fortunes.
Yeah.
It's just a powerful demonstration of the non-random, path-dependent nature of how institutions develop. And it confirms the hypothesis. Institutions are the foundation, but we have to recognize that even a perfect, robust system isn't static. Which brings us to the idea that institutional quality isn't guaranteed forever. How does success itself lead to decline?
And this is where it gets really counterintuitive for me. We've just established that the rules set centuries ago can still determine a country's fate. But now the source material is suggesting that institutional erosion, so a decline in the quality of the rules, is actually predetermined by economic growth. How can success undermine its own foundation?
Because the initial set of rules, the paradigm that created the boom in the first place, it eventually just wears out. The system outgrows it. As a society has sustained economic growth, the social system becomes exponentially more complex.
Okay.
Just think about the difference between regulating a small homogeneous banking sector in, say, 1950 versus regulating a globalized, hyper-interconnected derivatives market today.
Yeah, it's a different universe.
The simple rules that work for the first one are just catastrophically inadequate for the second. The existing institutional framework struggles to keep up, and it requires new institutional support, often of a completely different level of complexity.
So it's more than just being inadequate. It sounds like the system actively starts to break down under the weight of its own success. Like, you design a small fishing boat, and then you try to sail it across an ocean while loading it with more and more cargo the whole time. Eventually, it just sinks.
That's a great analogy. It leads to what researchers call an economic overheating model. And there are numerical experiments that contrast different development regimes, and they highlight this risk. One intensive accumulation scenario, what they label Scenario 2, is characterized by noticeable destruction of the institutional environment against the background of gigantic overaccumulation of production technologies.
That phrase, gigantic overaccumulation, it really paints a picture. It suggests a state where capital is just being piled up so rapidly, and the focus is purely on metrics like GDP and production, with almost no regard for the social cost.
Precisely. This scenario is modeling growth that is way too rapid and way too unbalanced. The pursuit of maximum production and capital expansion is so intense that the system starts to consume its own non-material foundations.
What do you mean by non-material foundations?
Things like social trust, administrative competence, regulatory stability, the spirit of societal cooperation. The system burns through those things faster than reforms can possibly keep up. Institutionally, the system overheats. And it shows that economic prosperity, if you pursue it without watching out for that non-material institutional foundation, can actively destroy the very conditions needed for its own long-term survival.
This gives a fascinating and honestly a troubling new context to the stagnation you often see in nations that achieve global economic leadership. Like Western Europe or Japan after their miracle years. The engine of success eventually just burns itself out.
We can see this idea in action, that achieving a new, unprecedentedly high quality of life, the very definition of catching up, can actually underlie a decline in the effectiveness of the institutions that got you there. Think about Japan's post-war recovery. Its catching-up development model was hyper-focused on efficiency, growth, stability. And that system was wildly successful. They achieved technological and economic leadership. But once that leadership was attained, the institutions of catching-up development became, in a way, redundant.
They were designed for a race they had already won.
Exactly. They were crossed out, as one researcher puts it.
So the very structures that are built for rapid expansion and, let's be honest, imitation, they're just ill-suited for the challenges of maintenance, innovation, and managing all the complex social demands that come with being the leader.
And this structural comfort can lead to a behavioral phenomenon some researchers call fading passionarity.
Fading passionarity.
It's not some vague concept.
Yeah.
It is the observable behavioral decline in a society's vitality, its risk-taking, its innovation, that happens when a population achieves an unprecedented, historically high level of welfare and security.
Yep.
When the immediate survival and prosperity of most people are guaranteed by robust social safety nets and a high quality of life, that urgent drive, the passionarity that powered the catching up phase, it just begins to fade.
So the stability that the institutions create eventually dampens the very societal energy that's required to maintain them. It leads to a kind of complacency and a decline in the vigilance you need.
Exactly. The acute need for reform, for adaptation, for continuous institutional innovation, it gets muffled by comfort. And this structural decline shows that institutional quality isn't some static feature you lock in with one revolutionary document. It's an active maintenance project that requires constant social and political energy. And if that energy is lost, the institutional quality begins its inevitable erosion.
So if that's the risk for established leaders' erosion driven by success and comfort, we need to zoom in on the most powerful Western system today, the United States, because we are seeing this internal institutional weakness manifesting, maybe not through comfort, but through severely declining trust and deep, deep ideological polarization.
The U.S. case study is absolutely crucial because it shows this institutional erosion happening in real time. And it's driven by major societal shifts over the last 50 years. This erosion undermines the very capacity for credible commitment, which, as we said, is the foundational requirement for a functioning long-term development system. We can really analyze two massive interconnected shifts that correlate directly with this plunge in public confidence.
And the first one, which is maybe the most corrosive, is the fundamental shift in economic reality for most people. The income distribution just changed radically after 1980.
Absolutely. Before 1980, the economic system, for all its faults, it delivered relatively broad-based shared prosperity. From 1946 to 1980, income growth was pretty stable and it was evenly distributed. All income groups saw an annual growth rate of about 2%. And crucially, the top 1% actually grew slower than the rest of society.
And that fosters a sense of fairness, right? A sense of shared progress. It reinforces public trust in the governing institutions.
It does. That shared experience of growth created a stable political environment where conflict was, generally manageable. But everything changed after 1980. We entered this era of extremely uneven growth. The bottom income group saw almost no growth. The middle class stagnated, while the top percentile saw explosive, unprecedented growth. This massive skewing creates societal tension. It fuels the belief that the system is rigged, and it fundamentally erodes trust in the institutions meant to govern the economy, like regulatory bodies and even the political parties themselves.
And then the second major shift is demographic. The dramatic increase in diversity, which fundamentally changed the baseline composition of American society, and as a result, the very nature of its political conflict.
Right. The U.S. saw this incredible transformation in its demographics. The nation shifted from being over 83% non-Hispanic white in 1970 to 58% in 2020. This transformation, while enriching in so many ways, happened at the same time as that economic stability was fracturing. And this simultaneous economic and demographic shift changed the type of political disagreement the system had to manage.
That's a key point. Disagreements that are rooted in economic interests, say between business and labor back in the mid-20th century, they were easier to compromise on because of that shared even growth you were talking about.
They were inherently non-zero sum. Business and labor, they fought bitterly over how to slice the pie. But because the pie was reliably getting bigger at that 2% rate for everybody, they could always split the difference through bargaining over money. They could reach settlements, like wage increases or benefits, because those agreements didn't fundamentally challenge the other side's core identity or their existence. They were, professional conflicts.
But the conflict today has shifted so dramatically towards social and cultural issues, identity politics, race, religion, gender. These are issues often linked to a critique of foundational norms, and sometimes labeled by critics as aspects of woke culture. And compromise on these issues it seems to have vanished.
Because these conflicts are perceived as moral or existential, they're seen as zero-sum. When fundamental issues of identity, belief, or foundational societal norms are at stake, powerful interest groups on both sides get deeply entrenched. There's often a fear that any compromise sets a slippery slope precedent that will lead to the total annihilation of their position. And this inability to forge compromise, especially around these deep cultural disagreements, leads directly to structural policy instability.
The source material even calls the resulting policy swings on fundamental rights mind-boggling variations in law. That speaks to a systemic failure of credible commitment within the state itself.
It highlights this extreme oscillation in foundational rules. Just consider voting rights. In states controlled by one party, accessibility is widely expanded. In states controlled by the opposing party, it is severely restricted. Or look at the constant chaotic fluctuation in the status of programs like DACA, where the legal and existential fate of hundreds of thousands of people hangs on executive actions or court rulings that are constantly under threat of being reversed.
And the most prominent example, of course, is the shattering of the long-standing, if fragile, compromise on abortion rights that has led to these constant political battles over what is a fundamental personal law. The internal erosion isn't just political friction anymore, it's the state losing its capacity to set stable, long-term rules. And this internal erosion, it's not just happening in the U.S. The OECD data paints a much broader and, frankly, a disturbing picture of declining governance and democracy quality across many established Western nations.
Yeah, the aggregate data confirms a pretty significant deterioration in the quality of democracy within the OECD and the EU since the early 2010s. Now, nations known for their consensus-driven systems, like the Nordic countries, they're still maintaining exceptionally high standards. But countries like Poland, Turkey, Hungary, Mexico, and the U.S. have all experienced pronounced drops in these democracy and governance quality metrics.
And what's the mechanism driving this? What's the common thread that's causing this decline across such diverse nations?
A key unifying factor is rising partisan polarization, coupled with the growth of populist movements. When political parties are highly polarized, when they view their opponents as, existential threats rather than just temporary rivals, they fall into this permanent campaign mentality.
Right.
And this makes fact-driven compromise across party lines exceedingly difficult, if not impossible. On top of that, populist parties often exploit emotional narratives and focus on dramatic rhetoric in their campaigns, which frequently sabotages the slow, complex work that's required to formulate sustainable, compromise-based policy solutions. And this polarization directly impacts a government's ability to govern efficiently.
Let's try to measure the damage specifically on the governance side. So moving beyond just election mechanics, where exactly is this institutional fabric starting to unravel in terms of functional capacity?
The data details a few specific areas of deterioration. The first is in societal consultation. Good governance requires governments to involve a wide range of actors, business, labor, civil society, when they're planning major reforms. But increasingly, we see governments involving fewer societal actors. In some really worrying cases, like in Hungary, Poland, and Turkey, governments are deliberately bypassing legally required consultation procedures or just excluding any government critical actors entirely.
So it's not just inefficient, it's actively hardening social conflict. It ensures the reforms will lack long-term legitimacy.
It's an active and intentional process of institutional weakening. It's like burning the bridge behind you so you don't have to cross it again. Secondly, we see a pronounced decline in media freedom and pluralism in many nations.
This is vital.
Absolutely vital. A diverse media landscape, free from undue political or concentrated ownership influence, is essential for informed public discourse and for holding the powerful accountable. Countries like New Zealand, Hungary, Poland, and Turkey have seen significant drops in their media pluralism scores. When the media market is consolidated, or it's subject to state pressure, the quality of investigative reporting suffers and the public's access to balanced information just collapses.
And the third critical area you mentioned is executive accountability. This is essential for ensuring that the rules apply equally to everyone, including the people in the highest office.
And this trend is alarming. The mechanisms of oversight are weakening. We have seen instances where executive accountability systems suffer sharp, abrupt deterioration. For example, the U.S. saw its corruption prevention score drop by 2 points, from a 9 to a 7, following the change of government in 2017.
And what was that attributed to?
Experts attributed that drop to the weakening of internal mechanisms designed to prevent corruption. Similarly, countries like Turkey have experienced massive drops due to an increasingly authoritarian executive weakening parliamentary supervision and judicial independence. When accountability mechanisms fail, the system loses its capacity for credible commitment, which just further cements the public's loss of trust.
So this institutional erosion driven by polarization, by zero-sum cultural conflict, and a declining willingness to adhere to checks and balances, it's not some abstract concept. It has immediate, quantifiable consequences on policy outcomes.
There is a direct and an undeniable link. The data shows that countries with better democracy and governance consistently achieve better policy outcomes across economic, social, and environmental dimensions. Sweden, Norway, Denmark, they're perennial top performers in things like pension systems, education, social inclusion.
And on the other side,
conversely, the deterioration in both democracy and governance is strikingly evident in nations like Hungary, Poland, Turkey, Mexico, and the United States. Internal institutional decay leads directly to less stable, less effective, and less sustainable policymaking.
Which brings us full circle, right back to the relational thesis. If a country's internal institutional fate is so vulnerable to erosion, whether it's from the comfort of success or the conflict of polarization, what happens when that internal weakness meets the ultimate external threat, the fragmentation of the global institutional club?
Yes, we have to move from the internal solo race to the external club membership. If development is fundamentally relational, then the fracturing of the global institutional structure, the system of alliances, treaties, and international law built up over 80 years, is going to induce massive and detrimental expected developmental shifts in all member states. And it won't matter how well their internal policies might be performing. When the institutional neighborhood deteriorates, everyone pays a cost.
So we're talking about modeling a geopolitical shift. A move away from the integrated, U.S.-led order toward a world that's dividing into potentially hostile blocs. How can researchers even quantify the cost of a collapse like that? A collapse of global institutional coherence?
They use highly sophisticated economic modeling, specifically something called the structural gravity model, and we need to understand why this model is so necessary. Simple trade models, they only look at things like tariffs and quotas. A structural gravity model is far more powerful because it accounts for institutional friction.
Institutional friction.
Things like non-trade barriers, shared legal frameworks, the high-trust environment, all the stuff that enables complex international production and investment. It models the cost not just of tariffs, but of distrust and a fragmented legal ecosystem.
And within this model, they quantify the fragmentation using a metric they call MATR. Can you be clear about what that means?
MATR stands for Measurement of Aggregate Trade Restrictions. It's a mechanism within the model that simulates the rising costs that come with geopolitical fragmentation. This includes increased regulatory hurdles, higher supply chain risks, less trust in contract enforcement across borders, and the economic equivalent of all these non-tariff barriers that block or slow down trade, investment, and the transfer of knowledge. And the model simulates a world dividing into three major geopolitical blocks: a Western bloc, OECD-EU, an Eastern bloc, including China and Russia, and a neutral bloc.
Okay, so let's look at the first scenario. Geopolitical fragmentation, but without a full institutional collapse. What happens when the blocs just raise their trade restrictions against each other?
Scenario 1 models this fragmentation by increasing the MATR between the blocs, but they maintain their existing foundational institutional affiliations. So, crucially, everyone is still in the WTO. And the results demonstrate just how fragile modern global integration really is. Exports from the Eastern Bloc to the Western Bloc were estimated to fall by 22%.
Okay.
And exports from the Western to the Eastern Bloc suffered an even sharper fall, dropping by about 33.4%.
Why does the Western export drop appear so much sharper?
Well, it often reflects the Western Bloc's greater reliance on accessing massive growing markets in the Eastern sphere for its final products, and also just the specific composition of that trade. A drop of that magnitude, a third of all exports, is a massive disruption to supply chains and the very foundation of globalized industries.
And what are the welfare consequences for the typical country in each bloc in this fragmentation-only scenario?
The welfare losses are immediate, and they are measurable. The median Eastern country suffers a welfare drop of negative 2.3%. The Western Bloc, which has greater internal institutional diversity and a larger internal market, it fares a bit better, with a median welfare drop of negative 0.5%. And importantly, the neutral bloc, the nations that remain not aligned, they actually benefit slightly due to trade diversion. They capture some of the trade volume that is now restricted between the two big antagonizing blocs.
Okay, now let's get to the truly catastrophic scenario. Fragmentation plus the maximal institutional break. This is where the global club is officially dismantled and the shared rules of the game just vanish.
Scenario 2 simulates fragmentation plus the Eastern Bloc exiting the World Trade Organization. This is a deliberate dismantling of the global rule-based system. It eliminates the shared legal guarantees and dispute resolution mechanisms that underpin credible commitment worldwide. And the quantified collapse is exponential. Exports from the Western to the Eastern Bloc fall by a staggering 57.5%, and Eastern to Western exports drop by 42.8%.
That level of reduction, I mean, nearly two-thirds of the Western export relationship with the East is just wiped out. Why is the damage so much worse than just raising trade restrictions?
The exponential damage stems from the collapse of credibility. Exiting the WTO signals that foundational rules are no longer honored. When there is no shared institutional framework, contract enforcement becomes massively more risky, investment halts, and businesses have to assume worst-case scenarios like arbitrary nationalization or asset freezes. The institutional friction that MATR models, it just goes through the roof.
And the welfare losses intensify accordingly.
They do. The median Eastern country in this maximal scenario suffers a negative 3.4% welfare drop. The median Western country sees its loss deepen to negative 0.8%. And this quantification, it provides hard evidence for our initial thought experiment. If Spain were dropped out of the EU club and into a fragmented, low-trust institutional ecosystem, the decline in its prosperity would be severe, and it would be quantifiable.
Let's get granular about who pays the ultimate price when the global club fractures. Which countries are predicted to suffer the largest consequences in this maximal fragmentation scenario?
The largest welfare consequences invariably fall on the smaller, often developing nations whose economic stability is most highly dependent on global trade and the coherence of the international system. Nicaragua is projected to lose a staggering 18% in welfare. Congo is projected to lose 16.7%. Even major economies in the Eastern Bloc take serious hits, with China predicted to lose 3.4%.
We need to translate those raw percentages into real-world impact for you listening. A 16 to 18% welfare loss is not just slower growth on some spreadsheet.
Absolutely not. For countries that are already struggling, a welfare drop of that magnitude translates directly into human tragedy. It means measurable declines in food security, a reduction in the state's capacity to maintain basic health and education services, significant increases in poverty, and a sharp curtailment of future life expectancy and opportunity. These major hits come from the total reduction in global trade and the disruption of crucial supply chains. It demonstrates that a stable international institutional regime acts as a vital, irreplaceable infrastructure for the world's most vulnerable populations.
This powerful data really confirms a relational thesis from every single angle. A country's economic fate is just intimately tied to the quality of the external club it belongs to. But the deep irony, as we saw earlier, is that the stability of that external club is entirely dependent on the strength and the vigilance of its founding members, many of whom are currently facing this severe internal institutional erosion.
That is the essential two-pronged threat we face today. The relational thesis confirms that when the external club fractures, prosperity is undermined and stability is lost. But the crisis of internal institutional quality, the polarization, the zero-sum cultural conflict, the weakening accountability in core nations like the US and key EU members directly threatens the credibility of that entire international framework.
The quality of institutions, whether they're domestic or international, is not self-sustaining. It requires constant societal vigilance.
That is the core vulnerability. Researchers in this field, they repeatedly warn that without social vigilance and political will, constitutions and guarantees are not worth much more than the parchment they are written on. Credibility is the non-negotiable prerequisite for long-run development. If internal polarization causes citizens and political factions to treat foundational rules as disposable, or if powerful groups use their influence to avoid compromise and override established checks, as we see in the decline of public confidence and the authoritarian drift in parts of the OECD, then this internal erosion directly threatens the credibility of the institutions themselves.
And the internal failure to forge compromise directly mirrors the external instability. I mean, a democracy that's weakened by domestic distrust, a society that can't even agree on its own fundamental rights, is structurally incapable of being a reliable, high-trust partner in the global institutional alliance.
Exactly. The decline in democracy and governance quality across Western systems, which we see manifested through decreased media pluralism, weakened accountability, and the inability to consult broadly or make enduring compromises on cultural issues, is fundamentally a decline in institutional quality. And that decline means the global institutional club, which relies on these core nations for its stability and commitment, is structurally weaker. This increases the risk of those catastrophic trade and welfare losses we just quantified in the fragmentation scenarios. The domestic failure to maintain institutional integrity increases the global risk of functionally being dropped into a less coherent institutional regime.
What we often label as a nation's unique grit or failure is often the downstream effect of its relationship with the dense, high-trust institutional ecosystems it is or is not invited to join. And the failure to maintain institutional quality, both domestically through vigilance and internationally through commitment, carries steep, quantifiable risks to future prosperity.